so hungry for purpose and meaning and identity that when the things that used to fill that void, from faith to patriotism to hard work to family, when those things disappear, that leaves a moral vacuum in its wake. I think, like you, Lila, believe that abortion is a form of murder. I think that we need to treat it accordingly.
Vivek Ramaswamy, entrepreneur and now presidential candidate for the 2024 election. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
It's good to be on, Lila. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm sure you're super busy. You're running a presidential campaign.
Running around, that's for sure. Yeah.
Exciting.
We're having fun.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to talk about life and family because a lot of our listeners and a lot of folks in general are interested in the culture battle, but it's also obviously has huge political ramifications, how we treat children, how we treat family, what does the future of America look like? So I wanted just to start with something that's been in the news a lot lately. As of 2020, the replacement rate is, we're below replacement rate as a population. So your average woman is having, I think it's 1.6 something children, which is below the 2.1 replacement rate. And they call this demographic decline could be a crisis. We're not replacing ourselves as a population. What's your take on why this is happening to kick us off, Vivek? And what is the solution, especially the government's role in confronting this?
So I think the replacement rate issue is probably the greatest underappreciated issue of our time, actually. I think there are other issues that we appreciate as big issues that we have to address. This is a big issue that we have not yet taken seriously, both on just the demographics of it, but also what it says about our culture. I think that one of the root causes of it, Lila, is actually our loss of self-confidence, weirdly enough. I think that in order to bring children into the world, you have to be confident in yourself and in the world and in the country that you're bringing them into. And so I think a big part of when we've seen the rise of this crisis of self-confidence manifest in the epidemic of depression or anxiety or whatever, raging across our country, by the way, up twofold just over the last 3 years alone. I don't think those things are unrelated. In fact, I think they're deeply related to the reluctance that many adults, especially young adults now have, towards the idea of having children or bringing new children into this world. And so in many ways, much of what I talk about in the campaign is that we're suffering from a national identity crisis today, where people our age, I'm a millennial, you're maybe millennial, Lila, is that fair to characterize you as? Or
I'm in the camp squarely.
Yep, you're in the camp, right? So people in our generation, we're so hungry for purpose and meaning and identity that when the things that used to fill that void, from faith to patriotism to hard work to family, when those things disappear, that leaves a moral vacuum in its wake. And when you have a vacuum that runs that deep, that's when poison begins to fill the void. And in a certain way, that's the root cause of the symptoms of our willingness to latch on to the secular religion of the day, whatever it might be, wokeism, gender ideology, climatism, and so on. But I think that moral vacuum is also at the root cause of a crisis of self-confidence in our country. And I think that lack of self-confidence is part of what accounts for the unwillingness or even lack of openness to bringing a greater number of children into the world. I have views. There's a big second part to your question is what should we do about it? We can talk about that. But I do think that seeing the root cause with clear eyes is probably the most important first step towards a solution.
I think you're spot on to that. And I will get to solution in a moment. You mentioned wokeism, gender ideology, I think climatism, you said. I see in addition to those ideologies, which are kind of wreaking havoc on self-confidence and really what it means to be human today and what life is all about, what's the purpose of humanity. In addition, we had the sexual revolution happen mid-century, this last century in the Western world, particularly in the United States. And so we have what I call three other ideologies. We have contraceptive ideology, which is this idea that sex should be totally divorced from children. It's an accident when you have sex and you get pregnant, as instead of it is the logical conclusion of a sexual act. fact, when both adults are fertile, it's the right time that you can get pregnant. Divorce ideology. So marriage is just broken down. People don't even want to get married anymore. They're divorcing. And then the last one is, in addition, just like you said, it is gender ideology. It's what is even a man anymore? What is a woman? And so you have this swirling sea of ideologies, and people no longer even want to have children, or they do have children, they get pregnant, and then they have abortions. And that's the other thing, 2,500 abortions are happening every day in this country. So it's the leading cause of death for a human being is abortion. It eclipses death by guns, death by cancer, death by accidents. Abortion kills 2,500 preborn humans every day in this country, legal abortion. So before getting to the government solution, what's your take on that? Obviously, it's contributing to the decline in our population significantly, but it's also a human rights abuse that's happening. And of course, pro-life Americans are extremely passionate about stopping this and saving these lives.
Yeah. So, I love something out of my initial response, but when you bring abortion into this and those startling statistics, can you just tell, just for my benefit, Lila, is how many deaths you said per day?
2,500 children are killed on average every single day in America by abortion. Daily death toll.
And you said that makes it the leading cause of death.
It eclipses heart disease, cancer, and even eclipsed COVID for most of the pandemic. And yet no one talks about it because we live in this pretend world where these aren't human lives. Yeah. Even though we know, when a woman has a miscarriage, we mourn the loss of a baby. We know these are humans. We just don't treat them like human beings.
I mean, we could come up with countless examples to vindicate that intuition. I mean, you think about what Clarence Thomas said from the bench in the Dobbs case, and I think he was referring to a real world example of a pregnant woman walking down the street and is assaulted by a criminal, and the unborn child dies as a result. I don't think you could find a person in America who said that person doesn't deserve liability for that death, right? So I do think that more Americans share our pro-life instincts than are willing to admit it. That's a separate point that it relates to reframing the debate, as you did, I think quite aptly, to be about human rights rather than this superficial notion of women's rights. It's not about a men versus women issue. It's a human rights issue. But it takes me back to the uncompleted part of my first response to you, Lila, which is I talked a little bit about the loss of self-confidence. I think that then leads to an unwillingness to make sacrifice in the moment that we live in, right? So I think you can make a sacrifice if you know what you're sacrificing for. And I think our unwillingness to make a sacrifice, it permeates so many different parts of our modern malaise. I'm going to go somewhere really far away, but then I'm going to bring it back to the issue we're talking about. I think our inability to declare independence from China is actually grounded in our basic unwillingness to make a civic sacrifice in this country. Because if we're really to declare independence from our enemy, I think they are our lead enemy. We never depended on the USSR for our shoes on our feet or the phones in our pockets. We do depend on communist China today for the same. We'd have to make some short-run sacrifice to get there. There'll be some inconvenience, but to do the right thing for the long run. That's a whole separate and unrelated topic we can talk about another day. But I think it's deeply related to something my parents taught me growing up, which is that the good things in life usually involve some sacrifice. Entering a marriage, you hit on this theme before. Entering a marriage involves a sacrifice. You're giving something up by entering a marriage. But you can make that sacrifice if you know what you're sacrificing for. Bringing children into this world and raising them as your children, or at least even the act of bringing children into this world, involves some level of sacrifice. But again, we can make these sacrifices if we know what we're sacrificing for. And I think in order to make a sacrifice, you need to first know who you are and understand that once you have an understanding for yourself of who you really are, then you can actually make a sacrifice for that actual value set that defines who you are, which means it goes back to this root cause, which is our hunger for purpose and meaning that's itself left unfulfilled, that causes us to lose our sense of who we are. Once we lose our sense of who we are, we lose our sense of self-confidence. Once you lose your sense of self-confidence, you lose any ability to make a sacrifice of what matters over the arc of history, talk about geopolitics, or even the arc of your life for the short run of what you think you're benefiting from getting back as a benefit tomorrow. You lose your ability to actually make the sacrifice for what you might gain tomorrow for what actually is the thing that matters over the course of your life. And I just think that's at the heart of the epidemic of abortion in our country is the unwillingness or inability of people to say that, hey, I know that bringing a child into this world, just like entering a marriage, those things do involve, we have to be honest about it, they involve some short-run trade-offs, that you have this thing, you don't have the other thing. But you can't make a sacrifice if you don't even know what you're sacrificing for. And I think that unwillingness to sacrifice, be a citizen of a nation, have a civic duty. We see 25% recruitment deficit in the U.S. military. What does the Declaration of Independence from China or the recruitment deficit in the military last year have to do with abortion or the fertility rate in our country? Maybe I'm a crazy man and talking about all of these things and blabbering and rambling in the same breath about different topics. But my point is, I don't think so. I think that these are actually more deeply related to a loss of social and self-confidence in our country. And these are really just the symptoms of that loss of self, of who we really are.
I think you're right. I mean, that sense of an identity, a moral identity as a people of what it means to be human and what's the purpose of the government and what's the purpose of the individual. Is it about service of others and seeing others as our equally made in the image of God? Or are we, basically living for ourselves and our own purpose and our own pleasure and instead of service of others? That I think is a confusion today. But, obviously, I know you're running for office because you know the power of the law, the power of the executive branch, the power that it has to influence the country for good and to influence culture. They say culture, politics is downstream from culture. Yes, but laws are great teachers. People put on their seatbelts now because there's a law to put on your seatbelt. Several decades ago, no one wore seatbelts because no one really thought twice about it. And then there's a law that says wear your seatbelt. So the law does make a big impact. So what's your position on using the executive branch? If you were president, what would you do about, both what you're describing as this, this identity crisis, basically, crisis of purpose, but also specifically about the death toll, that's directly feeding that replacement rate. But in and of itself, it's the bloodshed of our most innocent members of society, preborn boys and girls in the womb, and it's being done in the name of empowerment when it's anything but. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think that I'll answer the first part of the question first, then I'll go to the second part second. I think this national identity crisis, I think part of reviving our national character comes from the tone of leadership that we set at the top, too. I think it's underappreciated uniquely in the role of the presidency. I don't think it matters as much in the U.S. Congress or the U.S. Senate. I think it matters everywhere, but it's a critical part of what a president actually contributes to the country is not just the legislative proposals that he sends to Congress, but as Reagan said in 1989, in January of 1989, when he left office, his last speech as U.S. president from the Oval Office before he left was maybe his most remarkable one, where he reflected on what he was most proud of in his 8 years in the presidency. And the funny thing is, it wasn't any of the policy accomplishments, wasn't effectively bringing Russia to its knees by what was by then the very end of the Cold War. It wasn't combating inflation and regrowing the economy or any of that stuff, although all that stuff's really important. He said it was the revival of a sort of national character that we lacked in 1979, in the year that he was actually running for office. And if he looks back and says, here's the one thing that I did, it was the revival of that national character, which wasn't really done through legislation, though I think there was a lot of policy. I believe in what you said, Lila. There was such a thing as habituation. That's real. That was your seatbelt analogy. I think there's truth to that. But I think it's part of the story. It's part of a broader revival of national character where, we preach about, maybe you and I, folks like you and I at least, preach about family values or the importance of reviving the nuclear family in our country, reviving faith in our country, reviving faith in a nation. We call that patriotism in our country. But I think that it's been a long time. Probably Reagan was the last president where, you have children, I have children. I want to be able to look my two sons in the eye and tell them in good conscience that I want you to grow up and be like him. And I think the last president who I could say that honestly about without holding my nose or wincing or feeling like I was being dishonest in telling my two sons that was probably Reagan. And so I'll get to policy, I promise you, but I do think that we shouldn't skip one of the more important parts, maybe the most important parts of being a president that doesn't just preach about family values and about checking the box of saying God enough times, the minimal number of times you have to say it in order to secure a Republican nomination and then exhale again, but to actually live your life and lead in a manner that reflects that we're not just against race, gender, sexuality, climate, but we stand for the individual, the value of each individual, including the unborn child, the value of the individual, the value of the family, that we're not just against big government, but we stand for the best known form of governance to mankind, that is the nuclear family, that we do believe in the nation, that it means something to be a citizen of a nation, that you're not just a person dwelling in a nation, but you're a citizen of a nation, that comes with civic duties, and that, yes, we are a nation under God. I think that setting that tone of national character matters. Now in policy, I think, what Hungary is doing, I think is pretty interesting, actually. I had a conversation with a member of the Hungarian government to learn a little bit more about what does pro-family policy mean. I mean, we pay people, we have seen it in the context of the debt ceiling negotiations now, unforeseen amounts of money to do the very kinds of things that we should not want them to do if we're living in a virtuous, well-cultured society. We want people to enter marriages, to have a nuclear family structure with two parents in the home that bring children into the world. We're literally paying people to do the opposite of those things, right? Many women in the inner city, frankly. I visited the south side of Chicago a couple weeks ago. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society that we set into motion, supposedly to help black families in America, created the financial incentives for women not to be married, to have one parent in the house rather than two. Why? Because she's going to make more money that way. And so is it any surprise that you actually had a higher rate of, in this case, I'm only phrasing it in racial terms here because it was intended in racial terms in the Great Society that Lyndon Johnson set into motion was supposedly about empowering Black America. Well, let's revisit how successful that's been. When back in the 60s, over 70% of Black kids were born into families with two parents in the house. Now it's reverse, less than 30% in the other direction. I want to get the exact numbers right, and so plus or minus, I'll look up the statistics here back after the show. But directionally, that's about right. And that's the direct product of government policy.
Yeah, just on that front, I see that. I see that it's commonly talked about as one of the disadvantages, of this increase in the lack of marriage and stable households in the Black community. But would you support, as president, as an example, pro-family policy, and these have been floated by both Democrats and Republicans, quite frankly, which is encouraging, but a child tax credit where especially if you're a married couple, you get money back every year for every child that you have?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I might be more aggressive than I might be more aggressive than that. I might be more aggressive than that for a tactical reason that has nothing to do with your reason of asking it, which is that tax benefits are complicated, and it takes people a while to digest what that means. Many people who stand to benefit from them don't even know that they're benefiting from them. And the tax code has about 6 million words in it, whereas under my version of it, I think we have probably fewer than 10,000 that we need. But the spirit of it is, would I favor giving somebody a tax-free check if they're part of a married household with at least one of those leaders of the household working, and they have more than 3 kids? Yes, I think that's a very reasonable conversation to have. And does that involve more government spending? No, it involves less, because I'm going to take that money from the money we're paying out to people to incentivize them to do the opposite. And in fact, it's going to be net saving for the government because many of those families are able to stand on their own 2 feet anyway. So that's what Hungary does, by the way. And I think that that's actually smart policy. And I think it's been great for the nation of Hungary. I think it could be good for our country too.
Would you support a cash benefit, though, for families? And this is there's the Romney plan, and then there's I think a competing version from another senator. But would you support a cash benefit for families of, even if they have one, but they get more with 2, more with 3, more with 4, regardless of whatever reforms we may or may not be able to make to the welfare system? Because, single mothers do struggle too. They are some of the most heroic people in many ways in our culture, and they really struggle to make ends meet, and many are single not by choice as well. So would you support that cash benefit for families, even if they, we're not cutting welfare, and even if it's one child and then more for 2, 3, 4 and onwards?
Yeah, I've been looking at it in the context of 2 or more, in part because I share your concern that one of the reasons that people don't bring more than 2 children into the world, even in the context of a married household, is because of concerns relating to economic security, which I don't think are good for our country. In the context of an alternative to that, that's not been I would say that it would depend heavily in the context of trading that off vis-a-vis reform in other parts of, I've said I would shut down the U.S. Department of Education. That's $90 billion of savings right there. I'm shutting down most of the 4th branch of government. And so failing to add to government spending or stopping short of adding to net government spending is part of the way that I'll govern, but reallocating that to the places where we should be supporting families versus incentivizing the kinds of behaviors that we kind of have often over the last 60 years gotten what we paid for. I think you and I are on the same page there. So what you're describing is what I'm looking at for akin to Hungary's policy, 2 children or more than 2 children. We should have an incentive structure that allows people to bring and encourages people to bring more kids into the world than they are now in the context of a stable married home where there's already someone working. Absolutely. Incentivize people to work, to get married, to have kids. We need more of that, not less of that in our country. On the implementation of it, we could get into tax credit versus not, one child versus not, but directionally, pro-family policy, I think, is a good thing in our country.
And would you cut, if you're going to cut the Department of Education, I imagine you would cut Planned Parenthood's funding, which is the biggest abortion chain, and fully cut their funding.
Of course. This is no questions asked kind of stuff.
No question. Yeah. Excellent. And then when it comes to federal protections for the preborn, Texas has done this amazing thing where they're protecting virtually all children in their state. Governor DeSantis signed the heartbeat law banning most abortions in his state. What would be your tack, if you were president, on protecting children's lives?
Yes. So first of all, there's a lot of ways in which the federal government already tilts the scales towards, we're not going to call it pro-choice, we're going to call it what it is, pro-abortion position. Funding for Planned Parenthood, unconscionable. I think we need to roll that back. I think, like you, Lila, believe that abortion is a form of murder. I think that we need to treat it accordingly. I think that some of those state bills that you described are good laws. In the wake of the correct overturning of Roe versus Wade with Dobbs, which I fully agree with and have been a vocal advocate for a long time, that's what allows those laws in states across this country to become the law of the land. Where I land is that I think we go further and accomplish more if we're doing it based on first principles and moral authority, not just reactionary politics. And so for a number of reasons, I do believe that because most murder laws, all murder laws, are governed at the level of the state, if we believe, as I think you and I do, that abortion is a form of murder, that should be governed in the same way as murder laws as well.
It's very refreshing. It's very refreshing to hear that, because I think you're morally correct. And it's truly, I think it's also the just and loving response, because if we pretend like abortion isn't homicide, we don't just hurt the children who are being killed. We hurt all of society, and we hurt women and men and the future, because we are lying to ourselves. And I think it breaks down the social fabric.
And I think most people, Lila, here's where I'm optimistic about this. I think most people share pro-life instincts in common, as I gave you the example from Clarence Thomas earlier. I think we need to give them permission to get to the place where their heart often already is. By having the conversation, as I think you're courageous enough to do, maybe defecting from some conservative orthodoxies here, about childcare, about making, yes, a realistic option for women who otherwise view themselves as economically incentivized or pressured into terminating a pregnancy. Have an open conversation about adoption. Yes, I do think it is important to have the self-confidence to bring children into this world and the moral footing to say that is a good thing, the nuclear family. But if we're trading that off versus loss of life, to say that, no, absolutely, adoption is a reasonable option and an alternative to abortion, and that we need to embrace that as an absolutely legitimate next best alternative, even though that's not technically in the part of the pro-family vision. I think that we need to have a conversation. I certainly do all the time, and I support it. Willing to say we're walking the walk when it comes to sexual responsibility for men. What do I mean by that? In an era of paternity tests, in an era of reliable genetic tests, that we are able to, frankly, say that if you have a man and if you're the man and you're responsible and the genetically confirmed father of that child, that you will have greater financial liability attached than today, and more than financial responsibility, that you have real responsibilities that relate to bringing that child up in this world. We live in an era where tests and genetic testing make that possible. I, for one, as a conservative, would be in favor of state laws that ascribed more responsibility to men, to say then that takes, and it's not just, I'm not doing this as a troll to sort of take the legs out from the other side. I really am not. I think it's to stand for what we mean, walking the walk of being pro-life, to say that we are all in this together, and therefore it's not a women's rights issue or a women's versus men's issue. It is a human rights issue, and we're all in this together. So that's where I land on that.
We've got just a couple more minutes, but I have two more questions, and especially for folks listening who are passionately pro-life and looking at the field and saying, what is the candidate that can help lead us here? One thing a lot of people are interested about, in fact, I've had many people comment and ask me to ask presidential candidates this question. President Trump has said many times that he supports what are called exceptions. So if there's a baby conceived in rape, or if the baby is sick, it's okay to kill that baby. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So say the exceptions that he supported, just so I can respond to them.
He supports what he calls exceptions to pro-life law that says if the baby is sick, if the baby is ill or disabled, or if the baby is conceived in sexual violence, so the baby's father was a rapist, then it's acceptable to kill that baby. That's unfortunately the position of President Trump. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So I'll give you my personal perspective on it, and then I'll give you my perspective on where we are as a legal matter in the country. Okay. On a personal note, that's not a decision that I would ever endorse making in good conscience, either in our life or even in the life of making a moral judgment. I think we ought to be willing to make a moral judgment and say so. I think it is wrong. It is morally wrong to make a value judgment on life based on some sort of preordained playing God of deciding what kind of life we do or don't bring into the world. I think that is God's judgment to make, not man's judgment to make. And I think that, as the expression goes, I believe it to be true. Life is God's to give, not man's to take. So that's where I'm at on that. What does that mean for policy? So, as I said, because I believe that, this, I don't know if you and I, agree on this or not, but because abortion is a form of murder, I think it belongs with the states. And I'm running for president of the United States, and I think there are other candidates who have supported, and I understand where they're coming from on this, of minimal federal ban on abortion. I come down on the side of making sure that we stand on constitutional principle in leaving this as an issue for the states.
But
and the reason why, Yeah.
If the state's, just to clarify, if the state's violating its constitutional rights, the constitutional rights of its citizens, California is putting to death people without any trial, right? Any due process. So they're violating the 14th Amendment constitutional rights of their citizens by permitting abortion, putting children in the womb to death, allowing lethal power to be franchised against those children. Does the federal government have a role?
I think the federal government as minimally has a role not to fund any of this, to step outside of it, as we were doing today. Let's just talk about what the status quo is. My concern, and now this gets into, you both have to have the vision and how you translate the vision into reality. I worry, Lila, that once we open the door to the argument that, and maybe this is personal to me because I've made this argument on constitutional grounds for a very long time, that there is no federal authority in Article 1 of the Constitution or anywhere to have invented out of thin air some sort of so-called right to privacy, which was translated and construed into a right for a woman to choose, that we're on the right side of this constitutionally. This is something the federal government never had, either through the Supreme Court or otherwise, the power to ordain. That once we open that door, and you know this probably well, there's a whole slew of the next time a Democrat comes into power, then statutorily actually setting the minimums and permanently saying that a state cannot adopt a more restrictive measure than X, and they'll invoke the supremacy clause of the Constitution, the federal supremacy clause, to codify that. So that's a practical political reality. And I think it goes to the same reasons, Lila, why some states don't have the murder laws that I think they need to have either, right? And so I think that for similarly constitutional grounds, you could make the same argument. And so I think we have to, and I understand we have reasonable minds can differ in our movement towards the same goal. And the question is just how we get there. Where I land is I think we go further if we're doing it based on constitutional principle, including what's delegated to the federal government versus the states, or else we will live to regret it in our republic, where what we say is we believe that abortion is a form of murder. We treat it accordingly. We get the federal government out of the business of subsidizing it, which is absolutely happening today. And then we win this battle at the state level across the country because, as I said earlier, Lila, you and I share pro-life instincts in common. I think most of us in this country do, by talking about adoption, by talking about childcare, pro-family policy, by talking about greater sexual responsibility for the men in a relationship of conceiving a child, by putting legal teeth into that at the state level. That's how I think we win over the long run, and do so on principled, legal, constitutional, and moral footing. So that's what I land on. And I know we're, running a little bit, to the end of what's been a great conversation here, but this is the conversation I think we need to be having on the right, not shying away from it and, prudishly, talking about this as minimally as possible and then check the box and move on because we worry about electability. That you hear this, I hear this argument from political consultants sometimes. No, I think we actually unify the country by standing unapologetically based on principle, first principles, and moral authority. And that's the way that I'm aiming to certainly run this campaign and to govern accordingly if we get there.
Right. I hear you. I think the federal government's role, I think that's an important discussion worth having and having into the future. I know we've got to wrap here, but, the federal government has a role in interstate trafficking of children and victims. And there's a lot that the federal government does legislate on. And certainly with abortion, this is a constitutional right that we have to live, to life. So it is a right that the government has a responsibility at the federal level to protect. What's the good of a federal government if it's not protecting its citizens' basic right to live? And obviously the states can help enforce that. But should the states get to kill innocent people is the question at hand. But I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation in the future. I know we've both got to run and you've got your next thing to go to, but I'm looking forward to hearing more from the campaign. And I know Pro-Life America is really interested in your campaign and what you have to say. So any last words for Pro-Life America, why they should support your candidacy?
Yeah, look, I think that we're a nation grounded and built on the idea that we value every individual. Okay. It's much of what I've written my books about. Right? Woke culture, group identity politics, victimhood culture, seemingly issues that have nothing to do with my pro-life views, actually are deeply linked. where all of what we see today in the rise of group identity, it's also part of a symptom of a culture that no longer values each individual as an individual, as we say, growing up, in whom God resides in each of us, as you may say, as made in the image of God. We're saying the same thing. And I think the thing we're saying is that every individual life actually matters. And so in some ways, the kinds of issues that I've been talking about for the last 3 years are deeply linked to why I think all of us are pro-life, is that we're not just pro-life in the abstract sense. We're pro-life in the sense of each and every individual life actually mattering. And I think once we revive that conviction, this issue isn't just about abortion, right? This issue is about reviving conviction in the sanctity and inherent worthiness of each individual life, period. And I think once we get over that hump, not only are we there in the promised land of how we deal with the abortion issue, but I think we actually unite the country around a vision of what it means to actually value every individual. And so I guess it's a long way of saying, maybe ending on an optimistic note, I don't think this issue has to be as divisive as it's made out to be, because most
Totally
of us
agree.
share the common instinct and commitment and principles in common. And one of the things that we need to do in our movement, Lila, that you do so well, and I want to thank you for doing, to encourage you to continue to keep doing, is to talk about this issue in a way that's grounded not just in vengeance and grievance, but actually grounded in those principles that make us American in the first place. And I think what we'll discover is that we citizens and human beings aren't just automatons and votes that we count as part of some political analysis, but are actually people who can believe in those ideals and be persuaded by them. And so I think that skate to where the puck is going, not where it is. I think where you are is where the puck is going. Where we are is where the puck is going. And I think that we have to maintain our unabiding belief in that rather than to be taught the way we get to national unity is through compromise. I don't think so. I think we have to be uncompromising about the ideals that make us who we are. And that's actually how we'll faster get to national unity. So that's what I believe in. And I'm grateful for the conversation. I'm glad this is long overdue. I'm glad we're able to finally do it.
Thank you, Vivek. It's great to talk with you. Looking forward to seeing how the campaign goes. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So we just chatted with Vivek Ramaswamy, really great millennial. It's exciting to have such a young millennial running for office. I think he's all of 37 years old, so just a few years older than me. And it was a good conversation. I like some of his messaging. I think he does a really good job of telling the story of the identity crisis we're in today. I mean, he uses the words, I think talks about self-doubt and a lack of purpose. And he talks about how people are not willing to sacrifice because they have lost sort of their compass and their meaning. And so I think there's some really good stuff there. I really appreciated how Vivek was very unapologetic about saying this is a form of murder. Abortion is homicide. It's a form of murder, and it should be criminalized as such. I mean, he effectively said that. He didn't go as far as saying the federal government has a role in getting involved if the state is failing to criminalize abortion. So that was interesting. So he certainly supports criminalizing abortion. He even said he's against exceptions. So these cases where they're saying the child can be killed just because the child's disabled or something like this, obviously it's horrible. The child deserves to live no matter what. And abortion's always wrong. It's always the intentional killing of that child, and it's always wrong. We didn't go into the details too much. We had limited time, but he did say he was at least personally against that. Okay, personal is good, but you were running for president. This isn't just like your personal opinion and you work at a bank. Like, you want to be the president of the United States. And I think he knows that. So what's your role if you were president? What would be your role in protecting these children? And so he said some good things. He said, well, I'd certainly defund Planned Parenthood. He said that I would advocate for life as a leader, just saying I'm very pro-life as a leader, set that example. He supports states that ban abortion. The part that was a little squishy, and I kind of told him this after we talked, that I want to hear more from the campaign and from him, is, okay, what does it look like as a federal government when you have states like California that are killing babies through all 9 months of pregnancy? What does the federal government do? This is the argument for a federal ban on abortion. Because if you have states that are so pro-abortion, they're still killing children, and they're weaponizing the power of the medical community against children. They're franchising doctors to go be hitmen to kill babies and to be paid for that. The federal government certainly has a role. And, that's the whole idea, well, the federal government doesn't get involved. The federal government absolutely gets involved in so many fights. The federal government is against, trafficking and enforces, it's a federal crime to traffic human beings. It's a federal crime to distribute child pornography. It's a federal crime to traffic drugs between states. There's a lot of federal crimes. But the question is, when do the feds get involved? Well, they get involved if a citizen's constitutional rights aren't being protected in their state. Then that individual can appeal to the federal government saying, my rights are not being protected. And the child in the womb has a right to life equal to yours or mine. And we have equal protection under the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment in our U.S. Constitution. The 14th Amendment has this equal protection clause that says that all persons have the right to equal treatment under the law, basically, and you're not allowed to be killed without, you're not allowed to receive any punishment without due process and be deprived of, I think it's life, liberty, or property without due process. So child in the womb has no due process. There's no trial that says, oh, the child in the womb killed somebody and so therefore could be given the death penalty by abortion. No, that's ridiculous, obviously. So all this to say, the federal government absolutely has a role to play in protecting children in the womb, 1,000%, especially when states aren't doing their job, like California. And so I think that can look like a lot of things. It absolutely can look like a federal abortion ban. I think abortion should be a federal crime. It's committed so frequently in so many places. I think it can look like the federal government banning the sale of abortion drugs. That's a federal, easily a federal job for, a job for the government, for the executive branch, even to make an executive order against the abortion pill. The Food and Drug Administration is a part of the executive branch, part of the administration, and they are the ones that mainstreamed, they licensed the abortion pill. They made it possible to sell the abortion pill under President Clinton. So you can just ban the abortion pill. FDA bans it, says it cannot be sold. So there's a lot that the federal government can do. So I would have liked to hear more on that. He's a new candidate. He's new to the political scene. We'll be watching his campaign. We'll be in conversations with his campaign on my personal capacity. But yeah, looking forward to seeing what comes of that. I'd like to see more strength and passion on exactly what we do at the federal level, because that's what the president's job is. It's federal work. But I did like a lot of what he said, and I think he's definitely an interesting candidate that we'll be watching carefully. Let me know what you think in the comments, and looking forward to interviewing more candidates.